I see trees of green.
I want to talk a little bit about the philosophy behind this course, why I set it up, and I really want to hear different stories about our motivations in tree growing. I set the Master TreeGrower course up when I was working at Melbourne University. I was there from 95 to about 12 years ago, and my focus is to work with farmers and revegetation. I was landholder myself when I was there, and that program we've now taken around Australia 120 or so courses like this in little halls and sheds in various places, to Uganda, to Nigeria, I can do that one, and to Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Indonesia. I've trained a group of local foresters to run programs there. They've run about 30 or 40. East Timor, we've done a few Master Tree Growers over there, and Vanuatu. And some of those are just wonderful places to go to. But that experience was more about the fact that we all, as landholders, see an opportunity. We just want to find ways to make our property more productive, even if we're feeding our family, more interesting and more exciting, and possibly for many of us also, I just turned 60. So now it's about the legacy turning over in the future. So that's my history. I'm a tree grower myself, and I'll show you some photographs of our farm, but I'm also a forest scientist. I get criticised by my peers in forestry because I seem to want to make a distinction between a forester and a forest scientist. That's partly because not many people appreciate you go to university for 6 or 8 years to be a forester. It sounds like a lumberjack in some respects. I sort of love the science of forestry. I love the science of trees and ecology and landscapes and soils and climate and how it all fits together in some respect. And I often use the analogy between a fisherman and a marine scientist. And that's it. But the great thing about our profession, because it's applied, I'm also the one cutting down trees and planting them and doing things in that landscape as well. And that's really exciting. So when I mentioned forestry, particularly in this region, or right around Victoria, or even right around the world, I can show 2 photographs. Management of native forest and industrial pine plantations. And most farmers say, well, I don't want a part of either of those. I don't want this on my land. It's high risk. It's uncertain. There might only be one buyer for the timber. How am I going to live while the trees are growing? And other people say, well, we don't want this in our landscape for similar reasons. But what I see in that great forestry debate is sort of encompasses everything. We want to leave that out there and come inside here and think not about what other people are doing, think about what we're doing. And what I love about the science is this photograph of the Royal Botanical Gardens in Melbourne. It's the same science. It's the same ideas. The ugliness that some people see in what other people do with forestry science doesn't need to apply to your landscape. But the science underpinning it will be the same. The way trees grow, the way you can manipulate the growth, the way you can mix species together, the way soils behave will change. So there's a few old hippies there who probably read the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So I change his wording around and say, the ugliness that some people see in technology, or the ugliness that some people see in forestry, is not inherent in forestry. Forestry is just the growing of trees. And whether you're growing a botanic gardens or a timber plantation or a biodiverse landscape for wildlife, it's all the same. So today we're leaving that out and we're saying, what do you want to do with your tree growing? And how can the science and practice, some of which we'll learn from other people doing things in very different ways, how can you use that science and practice, and possibly even the markets, and possibly some of the research that they've done for a totally different reason. How can you use that to achieve beauty in your landscape? And this is one of the most beautiful farming Master Tree Grower landscapes that I've ever seen. Jenny did this course in 1997, one of the first we ran. It's in Bridgetown in Western Australia. And this is 10 years later when I visited the property. Now, obviously the course didn't do everything here. But what I saw was by doing the Master Tree Grower, we helped, and there was a group of us who worked with farmers in Western Australia. We gave her the license to do whatever she wanted to do with tree growing. And she created something that reflected her and her family's aspirations for trees. There's recreation, there's conservation, there's production, there's things you can't see. The use of land that had dildren on it that she couldn't graze, so she found a way of growing trees on that country. She's growing sandalwood in the back paddock, which is a high-value native timber, obviously. She's put it all together in a way that doesn't copy anyone. It's just putting that knowledge and that practice together in a way that makes, to me, a beautiful landscape. And what makes it beautiful is because I think when you look at this picture, you know that there is someone there who created that. There's someone behind that. It's not a company. It's not a NGO from the other side of the world. It's a person who is attached to that landscape, cares for that, and wants to create something beautiful for them. And I think we can see that beauty. And I see that beauty when I go to farms. You know, I get in trouble because and some of you might actually have these plantations. You know, the Fawn project up here in northeast Victoria that handed out money, but you only got the money if you planted the species they wanted, the spacing that they wanted, on the land that they thought was right enough, and you did it at the scale that they thought was relevant. So all those plantations look the same. I have the same argument with the conservation agenda. They say, we'll give you money, but only if you plant locally indigenous species in this particular location, and you don't touch it ever. Those plantings end up looking very much the same. So when you go to farms so often driven by grant programs, you see, oh, that was the grant in 1993. That was a conservation grant in 2006. That was a different grant. And all you see is a history of failed grant systems. You don't see any personal expression about what that person would have done had they had the knowledge and resources and time to do what they wanted to do. What I see there is what I mean by being a master tree grower. You don't know it all. You don't know what the future will hold, but you actually want to see what happens when you create a landscape and get the outcomes that you want from your trees. That's Jenny. I hope the program had an impact on her. That's what I'm looking for across the landscape in some way. This is David. He's been involved working with Jenny. He helped us run the master. He's a bit of a John Woodley in Western Australia. You ever seen Dave's place?
No, but I've met him. He came to my place.
He came to your place. Very good friend, like John. And so that's when I was back at the uni. As I said, we moved everything to a not-for-profit group that doesn't have much money, but it becomes a place to house things. We've run the program right around Australia, in places where I don't know anything about the species, far north Queensland. But people, landholders, are very similar, and I hope we can touch on that similarity. We got some money from the Myer Foundation. They were really keen initially to get the university out of the university. And Philip Myer, the son of the original city, was it? And he's actually a boat builder in Tasmania now. He's still working with timber. He's still very interested. These programs have all come and gone, Land Water Australia and stuff. But we're still here, and we hope to continue and try to get the source of funding both local, and now this course has been funded entirely locally. Our group didn't have any money to come up here. And Reid and others have done a fantastic job finding other people and sponsors and your own contribution to make this work. So what our involvement is, we'll come and work with you in terms of making that work. This is me in Timor, standing on a chair running how to manage a mahogany plantation with a little saw in East Timor. And it's just wonderful stuff. I just get to learn and work with landholders around the country. Thousands of them. But this is more than a short course in how to grow trees. It's not a TAFE course. I've had TAFE ring up saying, you've got a curriculum, can we deliver it? And I said, I don't think so. Because it's got to be different everywhere you go. It's not a curriculum-based course. We've got a loose structure, but there's not much written under that because we want you to help us fill that in some way. In terms of what we're looking at, this friend of mine, Charles Massey, produced this book about regenerative agriculture. He actually talked a bit about this Master TreeGrower program. You might have, well, who's actually got to page 478 of this book? Well done. I think it's an aspirational read, that book. How many people have got not that far? Yeah, it's a hard work. Why don't you guys go to the index, look up Master TreeGrower and go back to page 4. And because he starts talking about he interviewed me, we worked for a while on this. He saw that what we were doing was quite different and that it was a tool in helping landholders enter that regenerative agriculture, which doesn't mean a lot because it can mean anything to anyone, but it's the idea that we can actually create productive landscapes that are restorative and at least work with our natural environment and can deal with some of the uncertainty and risks that we're facing. But to me, it's much more basic than that. As explained by Jenny's example, it's about landholders taking the lead and taking forestry away from the people who now control it and using that forest science and technology and ecology to achieve what they want to do. And that's what's exciting to me. And if we look at our Victorian landscape, all the private land holding there, that's pretty much a map of the land that's being cleared. And what's left, well, was actually the reason the Forestry Commission was formed was to stop the clearing of the land for agriculture. And that's where the forests are left over. It was largely where it's considered to be unproductive for agriculture. But where we own our farms, and I'm down here in Galways, we're on land that may have been cleared over 150, maybe 100 years ago. And we know that there's been a whole range of issues resulting to that. The removal of trees when trees were not really valued, because there were so many of them, you couldn't sell your trees. There was plenty of wood around. And the other values of trees are less. So nationally, the blue area is family farming. There is some corporate farming in there as well, particularly up through the Riverina, other areas. But largely this is where families, hoping to pass it on to future generations, are making decisions about how land is managed. Now most foresters work in these little green areas of public land, or in these hotspots, or what they like to call hubs, of plantation development, such as Mount Gambier and other areas where there's lots of plantations. To me, my interest was to work in this broader landscape with 100,000 farming families, asking can my profession help them achieve what they want? Because I have this fundamental belief that almost every farm could do with a few more trees and that they can be better managed. I don't know what species, but if they're committed to it. Because we've got a little bit too far with our clearing, and this stump was knocked over outside Sale and they put it back up. I think it's an old quarry, but it's indicative of the soil loss and the implications and the impact of doing a lot of clearing over a long period of time. But we've got plenty of examples, some from the northeast. This is just up at Rowan Bay, not far north of here, where dryland salinity, when we used to have rain, was causing enormous problems. The drought years really fixed up the salinity problem, but the problems we have with soil erosion are quite clear. Many farms have that, and this year has been a really good example. We've had big soil erosion issues just this year as a result. Loss of biodiversity, not acknowledged until 20 or 30 years ago, but potentially having an impact on our productivity, our resilience because of natural pest control, but certainly on the way that most of us want to own land in a way that actually sustains biodiversity. Right down to the productive level, losses of stock due to, or just the yield or productivity, due to heat stress, which has become more important, and cold stress in lambing and off-shear sheep continues. So shelter becomes often, I say obviously, almost always the first motivations of a group of landholders about why they want to grow trees. Maybe it is an important motivation for you, Scott. But I like to put all that together and say, for many of us, our landscape, when we got it or when we're looking at it now, we're not comfortable with it. You might be able to articulate exactly what the trees are going to do and where they're going to do. But so often our landscape is saying, well, trees must have a role. They're not going to displace production. They're not going to displace aesthetics. There's a way that they can add to that. But what we do with that landscape, you can get an expert in to tell you should do this, this and this. I don't like actually doing that job very much because it's not me who's going to have to own and live with that in the future. So we need the landholders to work on over a long period of time, maybe even generations to take that forward. I've been involved in setting up many landcare groups, and I'm still a member of two, but it's not enough. Just waiting for government to give grants to a small community group to pass on for a particular planting that a committee and government think is important at a particular time, whether it's carbon or whether it's biodiversity, and then a whole bunch of rules that come in over the top retrospectively. Do you know there's a rule in Victoria that if you received a grant for conservation 20 or so years ago, you cannot touch or even take a limb off those trees? It's just retrospective rules that come in because you accepted a grant, which was only a small contribution to the fence and the trees, and you all lost ownership and engagement. So Landcare's been wonderful about helping us identify as a community our relationship between our farm and the catchment, the conductivity of our water systems, get the community to recognise biodiversity values, but then the bureaucracies come in and they've actually changed into a welfare system to promote tree growing on a very small scale with no actually productive element to it at all. So a bit worried about that, but it's not enough. On the other side, commercial forestry, we certainly saw this when the blue gums were going in Gippsland, a little bit up here in Western Victoria. And earlier during the 70s, where companies were buying land and putting in pine trees, if the government says we want trees, and it's happening right now with our current Prime Minister, he said he's going to give the companies that have gone to the federal government and said the land is too expensive to grow timber. So the government's going to give them a loan. Interest rates are the lowest that they've ever been. And they're going to give a free loan to help justify the purchase of farmland to put in industrial plantations. I'm saying if you can't compete for the price of land, your forestry model has to change. You have to learn to work with the people who are prepared to own the land. But they're saying, no, we can't compete with farmers, and there's all these people from Melbourne who are buying land for aesthetic reasons, and we can't compete with that, and we've got to produce timber. I went to Chile. That's where they should probably go if they want to plant a big pine plantation. Because that sort of model doesn't seem to... Might have worked in the 70s when land was cheap, or during the dairy crisis in the 60s when farmers were walking off the land. But it's not the future. It's not the front foot of that tree. So big monocultures all in one place. You can imagine I get in trouble with the plantation lobbyists because they're the ones asking for all these. It's not going to work for most of us. We don't want a 50-hectare monoculture plantation that grows once like a wheat crop and you chop it down and start again. I always wonder, why would a farmer start again when they're looking at their landscape saying, I want to build it, I want to build wealth and capital in this landscape. I never want to come back to where it is. I don't want forestry just to treat it like a wheat crop. I want something that actually builds thing over time. So there's my best friend Andrew Stewart. I just asked, what would forestry look like if it was run by you? 100,000 of you in different landscapes right across the country. Not being told your land is too dry, too small, or your interests are too uneconomic to even do forestry, and therefore irrelevant to those interest groups. It's your land. You obviously love it. You want to be there for a long period of time because you want to grow trees. So what would it look like if we all did what we want to do? And that's, it might have a bit of conservation, it might have a bit of production, but I think it'd probably marry a bit of those together. And it will be done in a way that I overlay aesthetics. Now, I don't know what aesthetic means, but I think I'm coming to understand it's a feeling. It's about the joy, the satisfaction that activity is giving you, and how you feel about, well, I'm going to use that word, legacy again. Now, I've got a bit of a legacy in the family farm. That's where my grandfather would have wanted me to go, to Walgett. But I didn't want to go to Walgett, I was a coastal person. But my grandfather built that house. His father purchased that land back in the late 1800s. And they walked on and they shore 100,000 sheep without cutting one tree down. Now the reason they were able to do that, because we had 1,000 generations of indigenous land management that created this beautiful productive landscape, which Mitchell calls a gentleman's parkland, where the sheep just fitted beautifully. And the sheep got through drought on a lot of this shrubbery and the forbs that grow amongst it. And this fence line marks my, we used to have Christmas dinner. My mother and her brother owned this property, and we'd be in Melbourne and everyone would come together and we'd have Christmas dinner. My uncle wanted to clear more country because during the 70s there was a lot of rain cropping, moved out to Reid, it was going to go as far as Walgett. You know, the future was cropping, clear the country. My mother over there, with tears in her eyes, argued, you can't clear that country, we've gone through, it's been 100 years and we've had good years and bad years, but the native vegetation's kept us going. And she wasn't going to raise the link with the indigenous people because my uncle wouldn't have appreciated or understood that very well. But there was this battle about clearing the land. It's interesting to me that what I saw in this landscape is that is an economically productive landscape if well managed. It's not just native vegetation for conservation. Locking it up is not necessarily the solution. This is private native vegetation. For 100 years or more, our family generated income off that. Maybe some things were lost because there wasn't a lot of ecological knowledge, but it was still there, able to withstand the floods and provide feed and fodder during droughts. It's still carried biodiversity. So the idea of having landscapes that are managed for conservation and profit is not new, even in Australia. But the separation of that to locking up land for conservation and then managing only trees or farms for profit alone has missed an enormous opportunity to bring those together. And because our government departments are either a conservation department or an economic department, we don't see any bureaucrats coming out saying, wouldn't it be great to have land care producing income? No, we don't see much of that. It's a shame. As I said, I was on the coast, so I wasn't going to go to Walgett. My home forest was the red ironbarks that are now in the national park down at Aireys Inlet. I used to spend all my time in that forest. I've watched that forest through Ash Wednesday fire. I've seen it being locked up in the national park. I walked through that and said, gee, this could be a lot better if it had some active management. Maybe some really small, sort of low intensity burns. People get very comfortable with cultural burning, the idea that the impact of man can be a positive. But I'd also get in there with a chainsaw and see how chainsaws can enhance biodiversity. It's overstocked, there's too many eucalypts. It's funny how we've actually ended up with forests with too many trees in it, compared to the past, but also for the understory and the different things. But this little division here is part of the walking tracks that I go on. And if you like Frost's poem, the notion that there's either conservation or profit, that division, and you choose, I'm going to manage this site on my farm for conservation. I'm going to have the production over here. I want to encourage you to think, how can I create something quite new that goes down the middle, bashes through the bush, create a new pathway forward that reflects what your interests are. They won't be the same as anyone else's, and your landscape will be quite unique as a result of that. And maybe something that's so unique that it becomes really interesting. So it's with those ideas, probably not well articulated when I was only 25, and the family farm up at Walgett was sold. And I met my mother in a little shack in Nairobi. And Claire and I were hitchhiking around Europe, and then we went down to Kenya. My mother was there because she was seeing her cousin, who was a High Court judge in Nairobi. On an English passport, he couldn't go home, he couldn't stay. It was a nice situation. That's when he had the revolver on his chair in the evening after the whiskey came out. The property was sold at Walgett. Mum said something really simple to me. She said, if you can give me a good reason why you need some land, farmland, I will give you your inheritance early. Just a share, obviously. There's 8 cousins involved and other people. It wasn't going to be a lot, but it was enough to get 100 acres of land or so. And I purchased this property, which I hope you can see needs trees. And that was going to be my starting point. A property that needed trees, so no one could complain about that young guy planting trees on good agricultural land. It needed trees on it. And I was starting that basis within a farming community. And my aim was to make forestry, and I put this in brackets now, even the act of cutting down a tree, attractive to the farming community and even the wider community in some fashion. And that's been a 35-year thing, and I don't think we're winning in most environments, but maybe we're getting there. There's my brother. We built a house, and you can see there was no timber on the property. There's a few pine trees up in the hill. So we used that iron bark that I've grown up with on the coast. And for the house construction, ironbark's one of the species we grow because of just interest. I love the timber, it's fantastic. We lost a house in Ash Wednesday down the beach. So I built a fire bunker, a concrete roof. And Claire used to ask for years, and probably still does, why have we got curves? I think it's art. Don't know. But it's sort of aesthetics. But it's also the bunker, it's the cave to keep us warm. And inside the house we use a lot of blackwood because I love the Otway blackwood. And we grow blackwood because of that. Probably shouldn't because half of them are dying every time we get a drought. And I think I need another species. I'll show you my alternatives. But we wanted to create something unique that reflected our interests. Now that sounds familiar because I've been saying that about trees on the farm. I wanted to do that for trees. So this creek we planted for conservation, for shelter, but we manage those trees for profit. And I actually now am getting more and more evidence that the act of cutting those trees down for profit is helping in the biodiversity. When you come to the property, you can be the judge of that. If it was just a landcare planting, would I be getting the ecology and the wildlife and the elements that I'm getting now had I not used a chainsaw? And that's what I'm hoping to demonstrate. I had a bit of fun with the local council where they came to that creek and they said, We've earmarked this on our biodiversity maps as a crucial habitat. And I said, I planted it. And I said, yeah, but our job is to protect habitat, so you have to apply for a permit to cut the trees down. The guy next door's got Hereford cows shitting in the water. And you don't do anything about that. And you tell me that I can't cut the trees down, but you now value the habitat that I've created. Anyway, we've got the councillors out. And because that's a democracy, you get 100 farmers turning up, and the councillors listen, so the plan was pushed sideways. We didn't just plant natives, we planted lots of different species, because I want to learn. We grazed because I'm scared of fire, and I hate ragwort and blackberries. So grazing was a tool that I was using to help me not generate much income, but certainly just to make what I wanted to achieve better. And after about 14 years, it occurred to me, I'm starting to create something that doesn't look like what I've seen before. They don't look like landcare plantings, they don't look like forestry plantings. And I'm starting to think, well, this may be the story that people want to hear, that they can do something with all these things in 3 different ways. But could I actually make it work? The notion, can you plant trees for conservation and then produce something out of it? So I started working with some young furniture makers, and this guy produced that table out of the tree I planted there. I thought, well, yeah, people can see that. It's a $3,000 table in our local gallery. It was sold, it came from a creek planting. The tree didn't have to pay for the cost of the land because it was planted for conservation and shelter. There's still a forest there, I didn't go back to what it looked like before. It was part of moving forward. And when I say the stump is actually still there and it's important to. So we're going to cut a tree down. So this is about 31 years old, there it is. It's a messmate type tree, it's closely related to messmate. And we take out individual trees now and we pull them out. There's a logging winch on the tractor you'll see that I use to pull the tree over to make sure I can try not to hit the other trees, which is a bit tricky. That's half the pruned log sitting on that little portable sawmill that's very labour intensive, and it's not what I think the future of timber milling will be. I need to be clear, there will be good mills, but Brack's closed all the forests in the Otways and all the sawmills got paid out, so we don't have sawmills in our area like we had when I planted those trees, which is a shame. You know, people talk about transition. Well, transition in 8 years is not really possible, so we lost everything. So we've got to start again, but my key is now, is it possible? can you take out a single tree and turn it into some product at the farm scale, then things can only improve where we get scale in the future. And that's where that tree ended up in Mark Tuckey's furniture in the showroom in Melbourne. I think he got 2 beds. I got $2,000 for effectively the wood from one tree that I had to mill and dry. Then he took it and produced $20,000 worth of furniture. That sounded good. And I was, pretty satisfying walking down Brunswick Street. It was Hoddle Street, and looking in the windows. That timber could only have ever come from my farm, because I can read the growth rings and the history of it and the pruning history and say, well, it couldn't have come from any other property. So we grow some greenwoods. I've always been really excited. I grow oak trees, and mainly around the house for protection from fire. I learned that up here. I drove through and I saw all these oak trees and around houses after the fire, and only a few knots. So I grow that. We're starting to harvest some of our pine trees, and that's what we're doing now. We're doubling the size of the farmhouse. That's a blue gum bead there, there's a pine. I grade all my own timber, and if I hadn't pruned it, I wouldn't be able to use it. Because it has to be as good as furniture, it has to be better than furniture grade. I'm now sorting my timbers out, structural grade, long, clean, and what I can't use I stick down, and I'm making a table for my son out of stuff that I can't use because it's got knots and feature and character in it. So when you come to sort of think about the structural timber being less than furniture, I think it's going to be the other way around in the future. So we graze underneath our oaks and they eat the acorns, and I'm scared because vets tell me there's a risk of animals getting poisoned by that, so I don't know. The person who owns these sheep says, oh, I don't know, it's never happened before, we'll be fine. But we thin some of our oak forests and grow shiitake mushrooms on those. When I think of products we can get from the thinnings, it's a big issue. And there's something satisfying about watching a mushroom grow out of a log. These are inoculated at the shiitake. It's not a commercial venture, but it's lovely to take a couple of kilos of mushrooms in for the family, or to trade with friends in some fashion. But I just love learning about what's the science underpinning that. The fungus is eating starch and sugars in the sapwood of the tree. The best time to harvest the tree, you cut down a healthy tree with a wide, fast-growing tree that has a wide sapwood band with a lot of sugars. You cut it down in winter because we all know that trees store their carbohydrates. Think about an oak tree bursting into leaf. 1 million leaves maybe come over the course of 3 or 4 days. All that energy came from stored sugars and starch. Think of maple syrup. The maple syrup is tapped by putting a hole into the sapwood and catching the sugary syrup as it's being converted from starch into a sugar that travels up the tree to feed the buds so it can burst out. So understanding the science helps you understand the production and what you need to do. And that's what I always love. You find what you want to do, and then you search out what's the ecology and the science behind that, or you find a problem and you try to work out and explain it from the science and ecology point of view. So that's my interest in trees. There's more about me learning from the trees and using it, gaining knowledge that I can't find in the books that I do through practice.
I think to myself, what a wonderful